Alright, so I have to wait for a ride right now, but I'm not sure when it'll come, so I've decided to start making my response um, to the earlier comment because I do have a lot to say. Now, I think, it was said by this philosopher, Guy Deleuze, that writing's more pure than talking. But right now, I honestly feel a lot less aggressive than if I'd written everything out, so here goes. So first of all, what we have to understand is the origin of the material mechanical universe. Um, yeah, I think basically this has been pointed out by several people, both of them British, um, that this is basically a cultural presupposition which didn't ever really have any merit or ground in terms of something like scientific research. It was taken up in the scientific community, and anyone who's grown up with popular science, either through one's education or one's personal reading or a combination of both, holds this view, but it kind of seems not only counterintuitive, but if you look at the history of it, it's a bit silly. So basically, our view at one point in human history was that it was a kind of Platonic pantheistic view, which is that everything has its own soul and manifests its soul and thereby creates its own nature. Now, there's one reason mainly, and one reason really only, that in Western society we rejected this view, and it's a three-letter word that atheists don't like. It's called God. Little known fact is that many of the earliest scientists were in fact religious thinkers. They were trying to use science to prove the God postulate, and they tried to model their science after religion, much in the same way as some people insist we model our philosophy after science. Right now, that just doesn't work. So, what does all of this really imply? Well, we got the notion that, if everything manifests its own soul in a pantheistic way, there's not really room for a monotheistic God, so what we did, we adopted the view that the world was mechanical because it would allow us to conceive of a machinist-like creator who was intelligent, and that's God. Now, obviously, since God has to be of a superior intelligence in this worldview, because the Christian tradition places God as a superior, that means that the world of matter has to be something inferior to it. But notice how in this there's the notion of an intelligence. God is the one who set the world in motion. It's very ironic, you see, that the evolutionary theory, which came out of this, which was a way of explaining evolution, in terms, though, of this materialistic worldview, um, that it's counterposed with intelligent design, because you could actually think of the two as somehow being one. You could see the whole notion of any kind of order in the world which is conceivable to the human intelligence as a personal order. In other words, put in place by an intelligence akin to that of a human being. In man's image, it said that God was created in man's image, so there you go. But going back to the main current of this inquiry, it seems as though, well, basically, we established the notion that the universe is essentially mechanical. And what happened was that science lost favor in the Western community around the 19th century. This is during industrialization also. And people began to, did I say science? I meant religion. People began to turn towards science as a substitute for it. Our religious conception of God in the West, which isn't necessarily the same conception of God as in the East, is that God is omnipotent and omniscient. Notice the word omniscience. The last part of that word is science. This is not a mere coincidence. With language, it rarely is. Our aims in science were to arrive at an absolute truth, and maybe, maybe, to gain mastery of our environment, which is in a sense godlike. This was seen fairly quickly to fail because everything in science depended upon our abstraction, so it could be described entirely as a human cognitive activity and a cultural thing which had no relevance to anything in the way of an absolute truth. And people quickly began to question the technological consequences of using science and modern technology. But we'll get into that in some other conversation. Now, obviously in the 19th century, late 19th century, we had the Industrial Revolution, and it was very practical to conceive of things in terms of matter. If you wanted workers, basically, to do their work, you didn't entertain illusions that they were anything in the way of spiritual. You entertained the illusion that they were something entirely material, so you could employ them in a utilitarian fashion. So there was this whole, as is typical in Western thought, this whole split between the notion of, well, is everything spirit or is everything matter? Well, we decided that everything was going to be matter. Matter is not the manifestation of spirit, but spirit is the hallucination of matter. And people to this day, particularly Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, hold this view and are proponents of it. Now here's a bit of a problem. It's a rationalistic view, but not an empiricistic view. Obviously, a number of people have had the experience of being something greater than their conventional minds and being something greater than their body. From the standpoint of empiricism, which science is supposed to be based on, this is an observation. You can't ignore it because it doesn't line up with some abstract dogma. Current scientism, you might say, rejects that and always strives to confine those experiences which are described as spiritual in terms of its rationalistic framework, that intelligence and spirit are essentially illusions of a fundamentally unintelligent mind. And so, you see, in this whole inquiry and this whole investigation, the kind of cultural relevance of this. So, we're basically brought up to believe that the universe was essentially unintelligent because we took God out of the picture in the mechanical view and forgot why we even adopted it in the first place. There's never any evidence that the universe was actually mechanical, but obviously, as it happens, if you any kind of truth, as has been pointed out by the philosopher Martin Heidegger, depends in part at least upon an abstraction and or a mental conception and language necessary to describe it. In other words, our frame of reference for describing things is always going to be, in a sense, a reflection of our culture. We can't escape that. So you could observe the world and make the conjecture that it's mechanical. You could even project onto it that quality and treat it as though it were mechanical. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's mechanical, but it was practical for us to adopt this at that time in our medicine and in our worldview. But it ruled out spiritual experience. And a number of the people who are probably the foremost proponents of it simply haven't had spiritual experience before. Most people who have are very skeptical of this view. But that's a very long discussion that we won't necessarily go into. But you see how there's a cultural this is culturally relative, in essence. Think about the condition of the modern human being. It's very depressing, isn't it, to think that you have to come to terms with the fact that you're entirely matter. Now, some people say, well, I'm going to grit my teeth and I'm going to accept this. But I think the reason it's depressing is because it's not true. It's out of accord with our natures. All of us are perfectly happy, capable of being ecstatically happy people. But our frame of reference portrays the world and limits us to portraying the world in a way which is different from that. Now contrast with something like the Hindu view or the Buddhist view, that, well, arguably Buddhist view, because there's the doctrine of Anatman which can be debated, which is that essentially everything in the universe is consciousness, is intelligence, and we're not a recent development in it, we're a part of it. I'll continue this in a bit.